Hello, welcome back to my channel, and today I'm going to be talking about how to start a vintage wardrobe. Everybody's vintage is different. That can be because of which decade you've chosen, but also because of how historically accurate you choose to go. But no matter what sort of vintage fashion you're going for, it can be very daunting to start. It may feel like it's taking forever, you have no idea where to get clothes, you don't want to be spending hundreds of dollars just to get a couple pieces of vintage clothing. If any of that sounds like you, then I hope this video can help you. I started dressing vintage probably around 2.5 years ago. I started out dressing a lot more vintage inspired than like actually trying to look like I stepped out of a time machine. I didn't really do like the hair. I mostly just did like the skirts and some of the tops. And I think part of this comes from the fear of what people are going to think of you when you dress vintage. Some of the things I'm going to talk about in this video are what is the first thing that you should do? Where should you shop? Starting with number one, in my opinion, one of the first and most important things that you should do if you want to start a vintage wardrobe is do your research. Research is really important for a lot of reasons. The first reason is because it helps you figure out your decade, or even a few decades, or a specific spot in a specific decade. You can figure out what you like. You can start by just typing into Google Images 1930s fashion plate, 1940s fashion plate, 1950s fashion plate, and see what speaks to you. Your areas of inspiration can change quite a lot. You might change as much as a few decades, or it might just be refining down to a more specific area in one decade. For example, I started by liking the 40s and the 50s. 40s a little bit more were kind of my deal, but as I've worn vintage more and I've learned more about it, I've discovered that I really like the late 40s and the early 50s. Another reason why research is super important in my opinion is figuring out if what you're interested in vintage is the stereotypes or the more historically accurate side of things. If you have decided that you like the 50s and you really want to go for that, just like red and white polka dot dress with like the 50s ponytail and the cat eyeliner and all that stuff, that's totally cool. But it's really important to know if you're going for more of the stereotypes or if you want to take a more historically accurate approach. There's a few reasons for this, partly because if you have your sort of 50s inspired look and you post a picture of it on Instagram and you get comments like, oh, I love 50s fashion so much, it might not be an accurate depiction for them to be seeing, so you might be spreading stereotypes. If you're gonna go for that stereotypical look, that's great, but it's important to let people know that what they're looking at isn't necessarily historically accurate. But if you do want to go for a more historically accurate look, you might need to look up historically accurate 1950s dress or authentic 1950s dress. I'd recommend taking a quick look at Pinterest because you can see actual magazine articles and old clothing ads that are actually from the 50s or the 60s or whatever era you're looking at. But you do need to be careful that what you're looking at is actually historically accurate if that is what you're going for, because there's a lot of vintage inspired stuff on Pinterest. Other than Pinterest, there are lots of YouTubers. I highly recommend watching Rachel Maxey. She is one of my favorite YouTubers and she has a very 40s, 50s inspired fashion style. After you've done some research and you've figured out kind of what era you're interested in, you can try some things out. I think it can be very helpful to sort of test the waters before you actually like start spending all your money and replacing all of your clothes. There's a few ways that you can do this. I would be mostly helpful for 40s and 50s stuff, so I can give you some advice on that. If you're going for more of like the 20s-ish kind of look, probably not as helpful. One of the easiest things to do is try on a red lip and put on a white button-up and maybe some kind of skirt, even if it's not the right length or shape or whatever. Try it on, see what you feel. You probably have a white button-up in your closet. If you don't, you can probably find one at the thrift store for like a few bucks. So put on your red lip and your white button up, whether it's long sleeve or short sleeved, and try tucking it into your skirt or your jeans or whatever. Even if you don't have a skirt, you can just wear jeans, that's fine. Tucking in the shirt really helps you sort of get that silhouette and the sort of vintagey aesthetic. So once you've tried it out, if you do find that you like the era that you thought you'd like, cool, totally keep going. If you feel a little bit uncomfortable, I would say think about whether or not that is because you don't like the way it looks, or if it's because you're worried about how other people are going to see you. Because this can be quite a bit of a barrier between really going for like the full vintage look. I've gone more full vintage in like the past year. Before that, I was a little hesitant to go out with the hairstyle and the outfit and the makeup and everything because that seemed a little bit extra and I wasn't sure how I felt about that. But once I tried it, like literally just once, went out in like the whole thing, suddenly I was like, wait a second, nobody cares. I mean, I guess there were a few people that like would be like, hey, I really like your look. I don't think I've ever had like a negative response to any of my vintage attire, which I think is really cool. I think people think that it's really interesting and different and people don't expect it, so who knows, you might make that person's day by being unique. If you are a little bit nervous to try wearing your whole vintage aesthetic that you have in your mind, try just going out in a red lip if that's something that you're not used to. Then you can try going out in a very vintagey outfit, and then once you start feeling comfortable, you can start putting it all together. And I'm not gonna promise you, but I can almost promise you that nobody is going to react negatively. If somebody does, it's probably just because they've never seen someone be as bold and they've been in a sheltered little bubble where the modern way is the only way, which is honestly a little bit sad. If someone sees it negatively, then honestly, it doesn't matter. And I know that's easier said than done, but I promise you, it will be worth it. After we've gotten all philosophical here, let's move on to number 3. Where to shop. I have always been one to get basically everything from the thrift store. If you've seen my video, Why I Don't Wear New Clothes, then you know my stance on fast fashion and that I don't believe in it because it's destroying the planet. If you really want to hear me rant about that, click on the I think it's in that corner, I'm pretty sure, but I'll also put the link in the description down below. Anyways, I think that thrifting is much better for the environment, but also it's way cheaper. If you want to suddenly have lots of options to try testing out the different vintage styles, the thrift store is definitely a wonderful place to start. I would say probably 90% of my clothes are from the thrift store. If you really do want to try some historical reproduction, you could try websites like Lindy Bop or Collectif. There's also a company called Retro Stage. It's a little bit more expensive and I am literally the cheapest human on the planet. I have a wool coat that has that kind of vintagey vibe and I really love it. It was $10, which is an absolutely amazing deal because I bet it was originally like $150 or something crazy like that. Another great place to shop if you feel like you're ready to try some actually vintage clothes is Etsy. It's a little bit tricky to find clothes that are on the cheaper side that also are in good condition and also the style that you're looking for. I only have one vintage dress from Etsy. I have a lot of vintage postcards that you can probably see behind me, and a bunch of those I did get from Etsy, but that's aside from the point. The dress I found was from a wonderful shop, Johnny Bombshell. It's a little too short for me, so it doesn't cover my kneecaps, which I feel a little weird about because I've gotten so used to wearing skirts and dresses that cover my knees. Number 4. Another really important step in wearing vintage is knowing how to wear the clothes. And I know that sounds a little bit weird, but it actually is very important. I have a lot of tops that honestly if I saw them like 5 years ago, I would be like, wow, that's a really, really ugly shirt. But once you tuck it in to a skirt or pants or whatever it is, it can suddenly look very vintage and very adorable. So basically, tucking things in and putting belts on stuff. Those are like the general rules, I guess. There are no rules in fashion, do whatever you want. But if you're trying to really sell the vintage look, I recommend tucking things in and wearing belts. If you're wearing something that you thought was gonna look really cute and you put it on and you're like, why does it look terrible? Try tucking it in or putting a belt on and see what happens. Number 5. Accessories. Accessories can be very important to help to sell the vintage look. This includes hats and jewelry and gloves and shoes, lots of things. Jewelry I've found is probably one of the easiest things to find that kind of look vintagey. I do have one necklace that I didn't get from the thrift store. It was a gift from a family member. It's probably my favorite necklace of all time. It's from a company called 1928 that you can find online. I'm not actually sure what the necklace is called. I'll try and find it and put a link in the description if you want to check it out. That necklace is an actual vintage reproduction necklace, and it's like my favorite thing ever. Pearl necklaces and fake pearl necklaces are really quite easy to find, at least in thrift stores that are around me. Pearls do give off a little more of that stereotypical vintage kind of look. It's a very like 40s, 50s kind of thing. You can also find a lot of accessories on Etsy. Moving on to hats, gloves, and scarves. Once again, obviously, find them at the thrift store. I have one hat that's probably my most worn hat. I don't wear hats very often because I find it really hard to find hairstyles that it doesn't like ruin or that the hat can actually fit over. I have a pair of leather gloves that I wear a lot when it's really cold outside. Something else I'm gonna quickly throw in there is brooches and pins. I find that these really help, especially when you're wearing like a sweater or a blazer or something that has like a collar on it. Being able to put a little pin or brooch or whatever on it can often make something look a lot more vintage than it actually is. These are very exceedingly easy to find at the thrift store. Number 6. This one I think is very important, and that is faking eras. This not only includes taking modern clothes that kind of look vintage and putting them together, which I've already talked a little bit about, but also taking some vintage clothes from like the 80s and the 70s and the 90s and all that stuff and making them look older. There's a lot of 80s does Edwardian, 80s does 50s, 80s does 40s, and 70s does 40s. There's a lot of 70s does 40s. But this is when there was crossover in the styles between decades. It's easier to find an 80s dress that has that sort of 40s silhouette than it is to find a cheap, actually 40s dress. Number 7, learning to sew. Learning to sew is helpful for a lot of reasons. Partly because you can actually make pieces of clothing from scratch that are based off of vintage silhouettes. You can even find actually vintage patterns that you can sew with and all that stuff. You can make clothes exactly the way you want them, but also because learning to do alterations is really important. There's a lot of pieces of clothing that you'll be like, oh, this looks so very vintage, except for this one thing. The silhouette right here in the waist is not quite right. Learning to sew really helps with that. You don't need to be like a master seamstress or anything. Just learning how to mend something, learning how to alter something slightly. I actually talked a lot about this in my why I don't wear new clothes video. So I think that's pretty much it. Pretty much all you really need to know. I bet there's something I've forgotten that I'm going to remember literally the second I turn the camera off, but it is what it is. Hopefully soon I'll be doing a sort of thrift haul situation for you guys, and in that I can sort of give you some examples of sort of faking vintage and some little hacks that I've done. Some little things like buying different sizes to make a silhouette look different, or things like buying something that doesn't look vintage at all at first sight. So lots of different things that I can show you when we actually go to the thrift store, So I'll bring you along on a nice thrift haul as soon as I can. So I hope you enjoyed this video. Please comment, rate, subscribe, and all that jazz, and I'll see you in my next video. Bye! And all that jazz. There's so much footage of me just sitting here being like, what do I say? How doth one English? And all that jazz. The blender. Oh my gosh. Naturally looking knitted. Does that make any, I can't. I'm gonna stop filming. I'm done.